Welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be having a quick 15-minute debate about probably one of the most highly contested topics in the entire Magic community right now, which is the existence of the reserve list.
Oh boy.
It's a big one.
Right.
So we're going to have... So this is the format, basically. It's going to be 15 seconds, and then... 15 seconds. It's going to be 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yeah.
And then... And then we're each going to have 30 seconds to make a point, and then we're going to start again and have a counterpoint, and you have 30 seconds to talk each time so that neither of us talks too much. That's 30 minutes. You're right. Thank you very much, Jake.
Yeah, but this is one of the biggest topics in the Magic community right now, as Travis said. Like, Twitter has gone crazy over this.
Twitter is absolutely insane over this.
We figured we'd speak on it a little bit.
Yep. So our positions, we're not really going to share those because for some reason this topic's gotten highly political, where people will just hate on other people and believe certain things about them based on their views. So what's going to happen is I'm going to be in the corner of the let's keep the reserve list, and then Jake is going to be in the corner of let's do away with the reserve list, and we're going to debate this back and forth. And then that way, we can explore it completely, and then also you don't know what we actually believe so that we don't get hate, which is really the most important thing.
Yeah, that's the one thing we want to make sure. We just don't want to get any hate.
Yeah.
But we do want to cover this topic a little bit, so. Yes. All right, let's get to it.
All right. Who wants to start? You or me? We got a dice? Let's get a die roll for this.
Hey,
all right, odds or evens?
Odds.
All right.
All right. It's even. A roll the dice says it all. Let's put this baby back.
All right. So to begin with the idea of keeping the reserve list, something that I think, the biggest point is that people have invested a lot of money in these cards. People bought them back in the day. Let's say they made smart financial decisions. They, sort of saw what the market was doing, and they decided to invest in these cards because they knew they were going to go up in price, and because they knew that there was going to be a limited supply. And so getting rid of the reserve list would really be a detriment to people who did things like that. Your go.
All right, so to rebuttal that, Magic is a game with, cardboard cards. And, do we really want Magic to be a game where you invest in and sell the cards for thousands of dollars and stuff? Or when you could just go in the stock market and invest in something a little bit better?
Harry Potter and the audacity of this guy.
And a little bit more reliable. So is Magic the game that we want to be invested in as much as it is with the reserve list?
Well, I mean, how do you mean invested in? I think it comes down to how people like to enjoy the game. So you have some who want everything to be basically free, and this is not to say anything disparaging about them, but they want things to be more free so they can play more different kinds of Magic, like Vintage and Legacy, etc. Whereas other people enjoy the game because they like to feel like they're holding something of real value. They like the investment part. That's what's fun about Magic to them. They like playing with all these high prestige cards, and you can only get that with the reserve list.
Now, without the reserve list, though, a lot more people have more access to those older formats, as Travis was saying with the Vintage and Legacy. A lot more people will be able to play those formats and obtain those cards if they aren't so pricey at thousands of dollars, like, the Moxinar or Black Lotus and such. So, Magic could become more popular from not having the reserve list because more people will be playing different formats, and Magic will see a lot more players and possibly.
Well, in response to that, in terms of Magic becoming more popular, I think that getting rid of the reserve list would bring back the same problem that was present when they actually instituted the reserve list in the first place. So maybe you'll get a lot of people who are more interested in playing Legacy and Vintage than you had before, but you have all of these other people who will be completely outraged that all of their expensive cards that they spend a lot of money on are now completely worthless, and that'll drive plenty of people out of the game.
That could drive a lot of people out of the game, but I think that introducing a lot more people to formats that are a lot less expensive will bring a lot more people into the game than it would drive out of the game from getting rid of the reserve list. And I believe that is very important when we talk about getting rid of the reserve list or keeping it, and whether or not those numbers would reflect what would happen.
Right on time. Right, but we don't necessarily want to be sacrificing the few for the sake of the many. So, sure, maybe only 10 or 15 people out of, 1,000 are driven away from the game when the reserve list goes because they lost a lot of value. But should we sacrifice that number of people for the, maybe, let's say, 20 in 100 that are going to, come to the game and pick up other things? Also, a point that I'm going to touch on, and after your 30 seconds, sure. Jake, is that not a lot of new players play Legacy and Vintage.
Yes. So with Travis saying that, a lot of new players don't play those formats mainly because they're so expensive. I know, for example, you and I chose not to play Modern right away when we got into Magic because, it was a few $100. We were teenage kids. That's kind of a lot of money to us. And we didn't really want to splurge on those cards, especially when we could just play Standard instead or something a little more casual. But if it was less expensive, we probably would have pioneered into those formats.
Right, but the difference between Modern and then Legacy and Vintage is that Modern is not that complicated, and the problem there, the big choke point is fetch lands. It's not that complicated in comparison.
Yeah, true.
And the big choke point is fetch lands, which are not on the reserve list. But for Legacy and Vintage, where there are cards that are on the reserve list, those formats are super complicated and super tough to play. Where I don't really think that there's a population of new players who will be flocking to those formats. Maybe a lot of veteran players who want to try their hand, but on Magic Online, you can play Vintage and Legacy all day long for pennies.
That is interesting. But one thing I would like to bring up about the reserve list and cards on the reserve list is that they have actually been reprinted through judge foils from tournaments. So, like cards like Gaia's Cradle and was it Hermit Druid? Hermit Druid, I'm pretty sure, has been reprinted through judge foils. So
yeah, but I don't think Hermit Druid's on the reserve list. It's only $40, and it's a great card.
I might be wrong there, but those.
But you're gonna have to wait
yeah.
because it's my turn. So in terms of like reprintings, they don't actually have any functional reprints, which are because otherwise that would go against the reserve list restriction. But when it comes to what was I saying? I was talking about older formats, right? Mm-hmm. And their complication. What I was talking about with Magic Online is that, even especially right now during COVID-19, where the biggest rage is going on about the reserve list, people aren't necessarily taking advantage of the fact that they could play Legacy and Vintage on Magic Online, where like Ancestral Recall is like it's super cheap there. Wait, what's the time right now for the 15 minutes?
We are at 7.
Halfway through. All right, let's hear some more good points.
So with the whole Magic Online thing. Well, a lot of people may not have. Maybe that might not be true, but a lot of people may not want to spend a lot of their time on Magic Online and trying to learn how to use Magic Online. It is fairly complicated, and they could just play Arena instead. But you do have a point there with the cost difference between paper and online, and that will always be a thing. So when bringing up the price between online and paper is online is always going to be cheaper for the most part, I believe, and that's a good thing for the game of Magic, I think.
Right, but what my point there was not necessarily that it's always going to be cheaper. What I was trying to say is that even during a time where most people are playing online and people are like in the argument of, well, I would play Legacy and Vintage if it weren't so damned expensive. Well, it doesn't seem like people are really taking advantage of the fact that they can do that on Magic Online and with playing Legacy and Vintage, even though now that's really the only way you could even play that. So what I'm saying is, if these cards were brought down, all these people that say, yeah, I'll play Legacy and Vintage, maybe won't, because they're not taking advantage of it on Magic Online anyways.
It is interesting, but people may want to try Legacy and Vintage more on Magic Online if they know they can play it in paper as well, because, for me personally, I love playing Magic in paper way more than online, and I find online can be actually kind of boring sometimes, especially without that human interaction. I really like that element of the game. So if I knew I could play Legacy and Vintage in paper where I wouldn't have to spend a ton of money on it, I'd be more willing to play online as well.
Get off my table, bro.
Get out of here, Nike. Goodbye.
He knocked the light. Okay. So I'm going to transition to another point,
Sure.
which is, what was my point? I'm going to pause this real quick.
Sure.
What was my point? My point was about the, yes, that's right. Part of Magic's lore and prestige is in the reserve list. You have articles on, like the Wall Street Journal, lots of very prominent places where Magic is featured, which I think brings a lot of popularity to the game and a lot of prestige. Black Lotus, people wouldn't be that excited about the card if it was a dime a dozen, if you had to play it everywhere. In fact, it would just be banned outright if it was so, if it was so prevalent. I'll complete that sentence later.
Yeah. I mean, Black Lotus is already, banned and...
No, it's banned everywhere.
And restricted in Vintage. But, yeah, having those cards be cheap would, decrease the coolness or whatever of them. But if I could own one of those cards, that would be sweet. And just not being able to own a certain card because it's just way too expensive is kind of distasteful in a way. I would like to collect all the cards in Magic if possible.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things we can't have because they're too expensive. Like, we don't say, they should make more Bugattis so that everyone can have a Bugatti, which is different because it's not like they're restricting the supply. But the general idea is you can't necessarily have something always just because you want it. And maybe you just missed out on your window of opportunity. So there are a lot of people who provide this argument like, hey, you were just late to the party. And a lot of people get really sore about that. But it is a good point because, in my freshman year of high school, I could have bought a Wheel of Fortune for $45. They're like $300 now.
Yeah. But the difference between a Magic card and a Bugatti is that, well, one, you can drive around. But secondly, a Magic card is a piece of cardboard. And, people ask sometimes, is it really fair to be paying, thousands of dollars for a piece of cardboard? I mean... We know that Magic is more than just a piece of cardboard, but realistically and materialistically, it is just a piece of cardboard, whereas a Bugatti is a very expensive car made out of expensive materials that you can actually use for a lot of things.
Well, I wasn't trying to say exactly that.
Right.
It was just an example. But I see your point about the fact that cardboard is cheap. But back to the whole prestige of Magic, that cardboard ceases to become cardboard once it has the official printing of these cards on it, where now they're a piece of a real live ever-changing game that is enjoyed by hundreds of millions worldwide. And I think that getting rid of the reserve list and then trying to print the crap out of all of these really old expensive cards will just sort of temper down the mystique of the game and the wonder.
All right, we're at almost the 2-minute mark now, so
2 minutes and counting. All right, well,
the long haul is here.
It's been the long haul. What are you saying? Where's this cat?
So,
I'm really worried that it's going to step on something.
About the pristine of...
Prestige.
Prestige.
Not pristine.
Well, we hope the cards are pristine for that much money. My goodness. But, yeah, the prestige of the cards. He does have a point there, but, I mean, it just comes down to, these cards have seen their time, and is it time for them to have their time be over now?
Are you making my point for me? What are you saying?
No, if we got rid of the reserve list, then those cards have had their time. It's all good, but I think it's a new era of Magic is upon us very soon. At least I hope so.
Okay. So, when it comes to these reserve list cards, I don't know if I necessarily understand Jake's point, but probably in retrospect I will. But when it comes to these reserve list cards, a point that Jake brought up, which I think is a really good point, is the fact that most of these cards are banned everywhere anyways. You're not really going to be playing with most of the real expensive ones. Black Lotus, you can play one of in Vintage. That's an extra 0.001 win percentage sometimes. It's not that big a deal. And so why reprint them or why get rid of this important list when they're not very much played anywhere at all?
That is true. They're not played very much at all, but I personally would like to have, as I said, I would like to collect most of all the cards in Magic. So if I want to do that, the reserve list makes it very hard for me to do that if, I'm not Cassius Marsh or something like that. If I just don't have loads of money sitting around my house.
Cassius Marsh.
Yeah. But
I'm going to put them up here in After Effects. Post-production.
But yeah, seriously, if I'm a collector of Magic cards, do I really... The reserve list doesn't really help me when I'm trying to collect everything. And it's not just playing the game.
Right. But it is. So you're admitting that these cards, these important prestige cards in the reserve list, are collector's items. But what's interesting about a collector's item is that it's only a collector's item if it's valuable. And so if you destroy the value of these cards, then why bother collecting them? They're not really... there's nothing really to collect. Sure, they had a history, but now that they're a dime a dozen, it's like, why bother putting Black Lotus up there when even this foil Blastoise is worth more than it? Which is obviously an exaggeration extreme, but it's worth exploring that idea.
All right, the 15-minute mark has been reached, but I would like to say one more thing, which is, Travis does have a point there. But I'm not saying, we print the hell out of these cards and make them dirt cheap, like 50 cents. But we would like...
Oh, you steal an extra 30 seconds? No, this is unacceptable.
But we would like a little bit of a price reduction, okay? Like, don't make the cards like $1 or $2.
This sounds like this is your personal opinion
now.
You've broken the code.
But if they're like 50 or $100, I mean, you can still collect them as well. But
right. So... we hope that this discussion has been enlightening for you, and maybe we'll come back with a part 2 where we can be a little bit more vociferous and, a little bit more animated perhaps than just this laid-back, very calm talk, because we know that that's probably like the most aggravating thing ever for people, where it's just they're so calm about this really important subject, and it's it's how we like to be. So maybe we'll come back with a part 2, bring up some more good points, but I think this was a conducive discussion, and it's funny, we didn't actually have to call each other bad people. That's so interesting, Twitter.
Maybe part 2.
Yeah. Twitter, look at us.
I feel like
nobody yelled.
On Twitter, like...
Twitter's just a cesspool.
Like, if you look on Twitter and read it, then you can see how mad people get. You just imagine them so animated.